Chapter 3 Canem, or Danger, Terrible Truth. Quoting, "Thus spoke Zarathustra on the way to the Creator." Lonely one, you are going the way to yourself, and your way leads past yourself and your 7 devils. He who seeks a path towards himself is dreaming of a condition in which he will be able to endure himself. For this reason, no search for the self can be a theoretical one, for this search arises from the impulse within the living being to find a truth that will make his unendurable life endurable. Theorizing of any type grinds to a halt when it reaches the level of radical questions of this kind, and either leads to an art of living, Lebenskunst, or remains what it was, a symptom of wounded life. The idea that the true self might be something that can indeed be sought after arises directly from the suffering it causes. Only that which feels pain begins to search, filled with the longing for a better self, which would be the true one, because it has ceased suffering on its own account, an sich. Thus, only those who want to escape from themselves find themselves. It is the very desire to escape that directly points to the direction of the path that the search for self will follow. The search for oneself implies above all else the will to a path. The direction that path will take can initially be none other than the path away from oneself. Embarking upon the path affords the wanderer the opportunity to encounter his own shadow. Through the act of leaving, the wanderer begins to discover that he has taken with him, in spite of himself, just when he thought he had left everything behind. The true self clings to the heels of the one who is embarking on the path. But only when the wanderer realizes that he himself constitutes his own heaviest baggage can the quote-unquote dialectic of the path begin. Through the efforts made to flee, and also through the stimuli that accompany any meaningful exodus, his powers increase to such an extent that he can recognize and endure what, in leaving, he had not wanted to recognize and endure, the unendurable self. Only along the way does it become apparent how little of what the traveller has driven out of himself really allows itself to be shaken off. The more passionate his searching flight, the more vehement his realization of that which cannot be gotten rid of. Only the search that despairs of its own passion can arrive at the decisive point at which the search itself becomes as unendurable as what set it in motion. At this point, the agony of the search reaches its crisis point, when it gains insight into the unattainability of what is being sought. The searcher must burn out, vergluen, when he senses that nothing will save him from himself. He is extinguished in the dilemma of having to choose between the unbearable and the impossible. Only in the fire of disillusionment can the last remaining illusions be burned away. With the departure of what is being sought, the search itself becomes the goal, and the path flows through a tragic bend into the pain from which it was able to turn away. And here I apologize for my appalling French. Partir c'est mourir en peu. That is how all paths begin, but arriver c'est mourir entièrement. I'm certain that's terrible. Okay. The self-knowledged, selbsterkenntnis, entrusted to the path of experience has therefore the structure of a negative circle, in that it returns to its beginnings, that is, to its pain and its quote-unquote love, though the gradual repulsion of disillusioned ideas and the burning away of the images of happiness it had sought. That is, incidentally, completely different from the positive circle of narcissistic reflection, within which a seemingly material spirit loses itself, and then rediscovers that identical self in order to perform in the happy end dances of jubilation around the golden idol of, quote-unquote, I have myself. Ich habe mich selbst. I call this remarkably negative structure of self-knowledge the psychonautical circle. Nietzsche's theatrical adventure into the theory of knowledge is intrinsically implicated in it. His personal and philosophical fate depends to a great extent, I believe, on whether he can complete the task of burning away images, of whether his search for self can be successfully completed within the context of a beneficial negativity and lack of representation. The risk involved in any such uncontrolled search is extraordinary. It can easily happen that the searcher becomes caught up halfway on a vision in his own ego, because of which he will announce, having been duped and enraptured, that this vision is what he has been seeking. Ecce homo. Only a crisis will then reveal whether the seeker will plunge himself into a reflection in order to perish of its incarnation, or whether we still have a chance to turn away from the mirror in order to assume responsibility for his life as a discovery that is void of images. But Nietzsche's drama is still far from arriving at this crisis point. He is still in the process of expanding the stage for his great play, exposing its antiquated foundation and properly determining what masks the actors will wear. Let us look at what else Nietzsche had in mind for his Hellenistic psychodramatic stage. Contrary to what might be expected, what appears there, after the intermezzo of his contemporary critique, the untimely meditations, is not a classically masked hero, not a Wagnerian tenor who has been transplanted into antiquity, and not a hero who has been transposed into modernity from the family of Oedipus, Siegfried, Heracles, and Prometheus. What we observe here is a figure who cannot be foreseen, who hardly seems to exist in a believable relationship to the tragic stage. What is produced there on the stage is a sort of theorizing Leporello, a free thinker and on-stage enlightener, who reminds us of the philosopher figures of the stages of the 18th century, of the Figaro in the works of Beaumarchais, perhaps, and even more of Don Alfonso in Mozart's Così fan tutte, who, in his modish cynicism, has already mistaken the truth for a woman, and woman for a synthesis of the bottomless cask and the thing, quote-unquote, in itself, an sich. In the third trope of his self-objectification, Nietzsche reveals himself, prima facie, to be on paths that are anti-Dionysian. As I have already indicated, a critical activity that seems far removed from the mythological performances of the first scene results from this experience of himself within the Apollonian-Dionysian duality. Nietzsche now appears behind a mask of the philosophical specialist in abysses, also known as womanizers, Weiberkenner, as the illusionless grand seigneur to whom nothing inhuman or human is alien. He speaks maliciously and with bravura of the lies told by the great men and the abysses of the lesser ones. He presents himself as a virtuoso of cultural critical distrust. He poses as a libertine underminer of idealistic values and as a positivist psychologist who, out of boredom with his own depth, makes fun of lending out to the British a dose of platitudes, and to the French a prize for their infamous worldliness. Has Nietzsche thus completely turned his back on his classical and Wagnerian inspirations? The truth of the matter is that he acknowledged the Apollonian energy of resistance more openly in the psychocritical writing of his middle period. It is as if the rationalist in him were resisting subversion by the forces of Dionysus. In order to appreciate the dramatic context of Nietzsche's maskings, however, one must first see lurking behind this third mask, which is negativistic and imposed by Apollo, a fourth mask, the mask of Dionysian prophecy. This is Zarathustra, drawn up to his full height, who will resound across the stage as the heroic tenor of immoralism. a subject his psychologizing precursor had only hinted at aphoristically, jeeringly, and in a miniaturizing way as an intellectual chamber play, Kammerspiel. It must therefore be understood that the masks of the third and fourth orders, here the gay scientist, there the prophet of immoralism, represent essentially only the unfoldings of the Apollonian and Dionysian double mask, from behind which Nietzsche's literary appearance had begun. The antagonism between the two artistic impulses within the soul thus remains every bit as valid as their relationship as accomplices, with the distinction that Nietzsche is now setting in motion what he initially presented within the context of a static symmetry and frozen dialectic. Within the process of thought, the polarity between the extremes begins to swing out of balance, ausschwingen. All Apollonian attempts at establishing control notwithstanding, and because of this oscillation, the Dionysian, which had been at first exhibited only as a dominated and silenced power, gains in latitude. This is all just another way of expressing how closely this Nietzsche of the middle period, the one of the gay science and the great dismantling of values, is connected to the later Nietzsche, the one of the prophetic dithyrambs. The free-thinking, quote-unquote cynical, underminer of all existing values, an Apollo who is turned malicious, remains the closest accomplice of Zarathustra, the Dionysus who is turned immoral. The all-penetrating psychologist of the stage performs, in his exercises in the critique of knowledge, the recitationary? I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that word. The all-penetrating psychologist of the stage performs in his exercises in the critique of knowledge the recitative to which Zarathustra's proclamation of self provides the aria. Recitative. In the thematic arrangement of the birth of tragedy, Nietzsche had already established the prerequisites for his next step forward. In the reciprocal distrust of both deities lay the philosophical dynamite of the future. The age of ideas was drawing to a close, while the age of energies was announced. Radical doubt no longer leads, as is the case in Descartes, back to an unshakable foundation in the certainty of thought, but instead to a fireworks display of incredible reflection and a free play of doubting power. Doubt can no longer be assuaged in the certainty of ideas. Nietzsche forges ahead unchecked on the trail, auf der Spur, of insights and hunches. He discovers while underway through the psychonautical circle that a labour of negation will be necessary, that is as painful as it is invigorating. His gods experience a twilight from which they will never recover. The adoration vacillates. The brightly coloured paper wrappings fall away from the ideals, leaving them naked and deserving only of laughter. Wagner becomes questionable to a degree from which he will not recover. Schopenhauer has retreated far into the background. Classical philology becomes completely nauseating, and the values of the new German present evoke only antipathy and contempt. The period of willful self-deception through the idea of a greatness of this sort has come irrevocably to an end. The exemplary seeker takes it upon himself to destroy, piece by piece, the value system, the world of images, the pantheon of the noblest goals under whose authority his exodus was set in motion. Nietzsche commented on this in retrospect. It is a war, but a war without powder and smoke, without bellicose attitudes, without pathos and dislocated limbs. This would all itself still be quote-unquote idealism. One error after the other is put on ice. The ideal is not refuted, it freezes to death. Here, for instance, the idea of genius freezes. Around the corner, the saint freezes. The hero is freezing beneath a thick icicle. And finally, belief freezes. So-called conviction, even compassion, cools down significantly. Almost everywhere, the thing in itself, das Ding an sich, is freezing to death. No words could better express what it means to enter the phase of an active disillusionment. And yet Nietzsche's reflection remains too alert to settle down into a comfortable attitude of triumphal negation. The problem that will prove essential has already emerged on the horizon. If ideals collapse, what becomes of the force that has motivated these ideals? After one is no longer able to deceive oneself, the question remains, what becomes of the impulse that has allowed one to deceive and lie to oneself? Nietzsche's thought advances to a level that corresponds to that of a thermodynamics of illusion. It orients itself, as it were, to a, quote, principle, Satz, of the maintenance of illusion-creating energy, end quote. The idols collapse, and yet the idolatrizing force remains constant. Ideals perish in the cold, and yet the fire of idealism continues to wander about, objectless and passionately desiring. The period of self-deception has ended, without the reservoirs from which the lies were supplied having been exhausted. With this turning point, Nietzsche has begun to grow into a thinker whose thought will have incalculable, long-range effects. Now we can understand why, when compared to Nietzsche's critique, all other forms of a critique of ideology seem short-winded and reveal themselves to be almost scandalously in want of a self-critical alertness. His realism thinks, as it were, a whole epoch ahead of itself. In his play with the masks of the deities of antiquity, he has already begun to gaze into the abyss of a self-doubt that cannot be assuaged, from which arose the phenomenon of the fundamental untenability of reflexive subjects. What he gained from this is as disturbing as it is entertaining. His insight into the existential inevitability of the lie. One can imagine that what would become of a philosophy if this conjectured should... Let me try that again. One can imagine what would become of philosophy if this conjectured insight were to prove true. To a much greater extent, one is not able to imagine it. The compulsion to lie has its base in the nature of truth itself, as the young Nietzsche presumes to define it with the unabashed confessional willingness of this unbroken genius, as well as the relaxed receptivity of a man who considers it a distinction to be a student of an important intellect, Schopenhauer. But what is this truth, part of whose fundamental nature it is to make us lie? Nietzsche says it plainly. The truth lies in primordial pain, Urschmerz, which has imposed the fact of individuation on each life. Using the expression primordial pain in the singular is in any case paradoxical, since there are many centres of primordial pain as there are individuals. To be condemned to individuality is the most painful of all pains. As regards human subjects, it is at the same time the truest of all truths. If, however, truth means primordial pain for the individual who has been thrown into being, ins Dasein geworfen, then it is in its specific nature to signify insufferability for us. We are therefore able to want not to recognise it at all. And if we do surmise anything at all, it is in its immediateness. We do so only because the veil of pretense and representation that usually conceals it has been opportunely pulled back, so that we, racked with pain, suddenly understand more than will do us good. This would mean that the known forms of the search for truth, especially those of the philosophers, the metaphysicians, and the religious, are, in reality, only organised lies that have become respectable and institutionalised attempts to escape, that have disguised themselves behind the diligent mask of the desire for knowledge. What had previously pretended to be a path toward truth was in reality a single thrust away from it, a thrust away from what was unbearable in the provisory tolerability of comfort, security, edification, and transcendent worlds. After Nietzsche, it is almost impossible to overlook the fact that most previous philosophy was nothing more than an ontological whitewashing. With its whole pathos of loyalty to the truth, it committed an act of betrayal, as necessary as it was deplorable, of the unbearable truth, to the benefit of a metaphysical optimism and those fantasies of redemption that project themselves into the beyond. If, however, truth is not something that can be sought, and if any search for it is defined in advance as terrifying, intellectual candour finds itself in a position it had not expected to be in. Truth no longer reveals itself. If it reveals itself at all to the seeker and the researcher who actually want to elude it, but instead to him who exhibits the deliberateness and courage required to not seek it. To be sure, how he exhibits these qualities of courage and deliberateness remains his secret, and it is certainly conceivable that enough will always remain from the search for truth as is necessary for the search for deliberateness and courage, without seeking a non-seeking consciousness could not develop. I think I can say that better. Let's try it again. Truth no longer reveals itself, if it reveals itself at all, to the seeker and the researcher who actually want to elude it, but instead to him who exhibits the deliberateness and courage required to not seek it. To be sure, how he exhibits these qualities of courage and deliberateness remains his secret, and it is certainly conceivable that enough will always remain from the search for truth as is necessary for the search for deliberateness and courage, without which a non-seeking consciousness could not develop. He who does not seek the truth must believe himself capable of enduring it. All problems of truth, and therefore ultimately confluent with the question of how to endure what is unendurable. Perhaps this is why there are ultimately no techniques for finding truth in the existential sense. In the labyrinth, one looks not for secure knowledge, but for a way out. One may not therefore dismiss Nietzsche's entreaties of heroism, courage, and tragic wisdom as mere manifestations of pompous self-stylization and the mannerisms of masculinity, regardless of the extent to which the latter do in fact play into his habitus. Courage is necessary within Nietzsche's enlightenment, primarily for taking part in the phenomena of truth. Wahrheitsgeschehen. Because for him it is no longer a matter of a game of hide and seek, but one of experimentation and constancy, which remains if possible in the vicinity of the terrible truth. For this reason, according to Nietzsche, anyone who wants to speak of truth without using quotation marks would have to first prove himself as a non-seeker, a non-escapist, a non-metaphysician. With the acknowledgement of primordial pain as the basis of all other bases, Nietzsche's early thought places itself under a tragic, theatrical, and psychological sign, Zeichen. If truth means the unendurable, then knowledge of truth cannot be abruptly defined as enduring the unendurable. It is that which is unendurable itself that forces us, incircumstantially, to maintain an unwavering distance from it. Accordingly, the truth about the terrible truth is this: we must always have just missed it, And furthermore, we will never be able to have the sincere villain, to recognise it in its relentless presence, for we are able to want only what we can still endure. According to Nietzsche, knowledge of the truth therefore also means always having been placed at a protective distance from what is unbearable. Distance. That is the key word in the new tragic theory of knowledge, after which the old optimistic theory of the desire for unity was at an end. Philosophers, seekers, and dreamers might therefore continue to speak of identity and unity, but the thinkers of the future, the psychologists, they know better. Their thematic is that of distance, duality, and difference. He who knows about distance has made the optics of a philosophical psychology his own. The psychologist also knows that he is enduring just as little of the whole truth as anyone else. But through this knowledge he gains a point of orientation towards which the general theatre of self-deception and liar's play of life can be referred. The psychologist is well aware that everything is merely theatre. Through his personal union with the tragic theoretician of knowledge, he also knows, however, that it would make no sense to want to close this theatre in the name of truth. Indeed, the terrible truth is the mother of theatre. In accordance with its nature, we maintain an irrevocable distance from it, a distance that so radically determines our everyday existence in the world that, even with the staunchest will to truth, we are not at liberty to distance ourselves from this condition of distance. As a rule, it is impossible to survive the final dissolution of the distance that exists between us and the unimaginable reality of the terrible truth. Nietzsche's phrase, "We have art in order not to die of the truth," can also be read in this way. We maintain a distance from the truth so that we will not have to experience it directly. To speak ontologically, art, the old veil maker, has us in order to, in turn, protect us from having the truth. Art has us in order to, in turn, protect us from having the truth. There can be no doubt here. Wearing the mask of the theoretician of knowledge, Nietzsche has made an unprecedented appearance on the stage of philosophy. Do we now understand that this was no longer philology, and never was? Do we recognise how something new and unbounded has taken shape within his philosophical project? Action. Something new as pertains to truth as the oldest liar, whose wealth of discoveries is not exhausted as long as life itself attends to anything unbearable that might want to save itself in the liar's theatre of inventions and research along the brink of the unbearable. Do we appreciate that ramifications the idea of distance will have? If it is indeed valid, then our position vis-à-vis truth, independent of all our conceits of seeking and finding, must be one of an unavoidable evasiveness and a distance from which we cannot distance ourselves. If the terrible truth always keeps us at a distance, we are no longer able ever simply to grasp it. Whatever we may say about it, it is no longer actually there in what is being said. We can therefore no longer succumb to the illusion that a condition of living without illusions is possible for us. We are condemned to simulation by truth itself. For us, illusion would be the most appropriate way to conduct ourselves towards the terrible truth. We would grasp the truth only in that we have already eluded it as far as possible. All of this will bring forth unimaginable ramifications, since the possibility of our ever fully expressing the truth henceforth becomes a chimera. The terrible truth does indeed precede all assertions. But this pre-existence does not mean that the former could be expressed or represented in the latter in the way in which the idea is expressed in the symbol, or the object in the sign, Zeichen. The terrible truth is in everything we express and represent, but it is no longer present. It is not this terrible truth that guarantees the truth value of individual assertions. This could be formulated as follows. From this point on, any assertion remains, as it were, alone. Representations have been abandoned by what they allegedly represent, the truth, and must rely on themselves without the sanction of the final authority. The quote-unquote whole truth no longer plays along. It is no longer there in its supposed representations. Thus the signs remain unto themselves, relying on nothing but their own internal relationships, their own system, their own grammar, their own quote-unquote world. With this, the catastrophe of signs that have been abandoned by the whole truth is initiated, a catastrophe that is bitter, but also stimulating. The first character to carry out the prospects and the risks involved in the ambivalent disaster across the stage in an affirmative way will be called Zarathustra. It is no coincidence that this herald of immoralism is at the same time a rediscoverer of prophetic speech. Thus spoke Zarathustra is, in my opinion, an experiment based on the possibility of theatre after the end of the quote-unquote representation of truth on stage, an experiment that has not been thought out to its conclusion to this day. It is the first hypothesis on the possibility of an absolute play in the form of unprotected, pure self-expression. It is the incarnation of the transition from plays that represent to those that present, and an exercise in the semantics of God-forsakenness, that is, in speaking in the absence of the quote-unquote truth. Zarathustra's manipulation of language, Vertigreifung, is like a sound that has been transcribed into a linguistic music that, in its notes, carries out a fervent revenge on everything that could hinder the resounding of his voice. It is, so to speak, a nihilism that has become music, or a melody that has become immoralism. It could no longer permit any court in the world to either allow or forbid its ringing out, and, relying on the small autonomy of its real sounding, will submit itself to no foreign or external standard. Zarathustra's song is the daring self-staging of the Dionysian release from restraints, Enthemmungen, that bursts forth on the stage as the unprotected self-affirmation of a language. That Nietzsche also disguises himself as the Antichrist, and presents himself as someone who will save us from morality, the embodiment of all the lies we have endured, should be seen in this light, not as the expression of an extravagant overestimation of self, but as part of a stringent logic that governs a new understanding of art and truth. For in order to be allowed to show, in a self-affirming way, what he is, or what he wants to be, the frenetic and unprotected presenter of self must overthrow what was previously known as culture. The entire system of altruistic and dualistic values, with its poisonous cargo of restraints, self-reification, and self-negating impulses. Interpretation is unavoidable here. If what Nietzsche says about the truth is right, there would then be two truths. One terrible, which drives us along ahead of it by dint of its unendurability, and one endurable, which surrounds us as necessary illusion and as life-enhancing benefactor. As something that is necessary, this illusion, shine, has retained a strange ontological dignity and imperviousness. It also retains an ultimate transparency towards bad things that are unimaginable, but is not absorbed into this transparency. The quote-unquote illusion therefore, cannot be reduced to truth, and there is no longer in any way, as there has been throughout the entire tradition of metaphysics, the quote-unquote illusion of a quote-unquote being, although even now what is unbearable in the world precedes the bearable illusion. For all that, it does not impair the self-will of what is bearable. The illusion subsequently becomes autonomous and necessary a posteriori. What more would it need to flourish? Only now does the impact upon philosophy of what had come into the world in the form of the birth of tragedy become apparent. Anyone who might not have deciphered it from Nietzsche's awkward and precocious expositions on the composition of the chorus would ultimately have it forced upon him by the subsequent development of the motif. For what the ancient chorus, this self-entranced mass of sound that no longer represents Dionysus but is Dionysus, had wanted to indicate, is expressed directly and affirmatively in Nietzsche's aesthetic metaphysical work, and especially in the representations of Zarathustra, to wit, to hell with deeper meanings, to hell with higher truths. Let's call a halt to the idea of the pre-existence of meaning with respect to its expression. Long live the signifier, long live noise and smoke, long live the sound and the image, long live the illusion of the autonomous symbol, the absolute dramatic representation. Meaning, truths, abysses, gods, they must tend to themselves from now on. We will no longer concern ourselves with them, because everything we are meant to concern ourselves with must be illusion, endurability, perspicuity, conceivability, Vorstellbarkeit, image, sound, body, stimulation, contiguity, demeanour, taste. It is enough to open one's eyes. Where are the unbearable truths? In this instance, a life-dispensing distance separates us from them, and if we look directly ahead of us and lend an attentive ear to the present, we will see and hear the physically present illusion in its relative endurability. We will be able to do this to an even greater extent if art should occur in our presence, if choruses sing, or if Zarathustra allows his word music to resound. Quote, "From out of a never-ending abundance of light and depth of happiness it falls, drop for drop and word for word. A tender languor is the tempo of the speech." End quote. What blossoms forth here is an intermediate world of sounds and surfaces, not merely bearable, but actually inspiring, whose presence conceals the abyss of the terrible truth. It is only a matter of dwelling on the interplay of signs and sensualities, and of not sinking into trying to imagine something that is absent, as theoreticians and those who are absent-minded do unremittingly. If, as it seems, the principal truth of primordial pain itself brings about a world of bearable secondary truths, we can hold on to the latter as long as we are able to succeed in not thinking about it, and do not break out of cheerful observation into speculation. Accordingly, we may neither remember primordial pain abstractly, nor anticipate its return imaginatively. Whatever was, and will be again, must take care of itself in its own good time. But he who seeks to get a grasp on neither the pain of birth nor that of death, and thus lets the matter of the unbearable and the unimaginable drop, he can discover before him, with no further ado, an intermediate world made up of sensual presences. The average human destiny is fulfilled in this, and only in this, in-between or intermediate world. Nietzsche uses this expression in The Birth of Tragedy for the Olympian sphere. And yet, in this intermediate world, the penultimate is perceived as the ultimate, and the tentative as the conclusive. It exists because man engages in the ephemeral as if it were the permanent. The blossom of the intermediate world is art, which in rare instances can ascend to the level of the tragic, a type of art that itself is the highest form of philosophy. Within it, the illusion of the illusion has become reflexive and portrays itself, at a dizzying height, as a happy lie and as the most genuine deception. Nothing comes closer to the truth than whenever the beautiful places itself as a fragile, endurable thing before the foundation of the unbearable. If philosophy is art, to paraphrase Heidegger, it is art of existing in an endurable way, of being exempted from the unendurable. Thus the idea of scrutinizing oneself in the process of the play of aesthetics becomes one of the points of junction in Nietzsche's philosophical perception. The phenomenon of art as the living manifestation of lying, image-creating, inventive energy offers an enticing opportunity for the self-objectification of a life that is compelled to seek. For it may be that individuals with a deep wound and a great sense of compulsion, even though there is no chance of their occupying a defined form of self-existence and finding comfort in a specific mask, they are still free to experience themselves within the context of their own aesthetic efforts, and to say to themselves, at least in that which I can reveal to myself as an artist, I can leave behind my own truth, the truth of myself, even if it might soon be superseded and forgotten. I no longer need to have any doubt, at least in what the course taken by the storm of the production of myself has exposed of me. And even if it were true that I, like all individuated life, am only a plunge from the unbearable into the unbearable, here at this point in the course of the plunge, I am enduring myself as best I can. I am with myself, and I no longer have to skeptically undermine the fact of my being real as a knowing mask. Fingo ergo sum. There is thus still so much invested in the most unstable self-production that it has placed itself in the world once and for all as a fragment of a real illusion. Through it, the aesthetic subject gains, through the vortex of self-doubt, its first and perhaps only foretaste of an irreducible existence that is superior to any penetration. There is something there. It can see itself and it can be seen. It can even, semi-empirically in its own defence, accept itself and validate itself. The whole world could collapse without any doubt having to arise in what pure self-perception called to the artist at the instance of his expenditure. This is what I was. That happened to me. I was necessary in achieving this effect. It may not be of much use as a work of art, but whatever speaks in it spoke through me. I may be ephemeral, but my ephemerality is negated in what became real through my participation in artistic phenomenon. Whatever Nietzsche addresses, the movement of his own self-awareness is bound to the tracer path, Leuchtspur, of his great literary publications, in that it is actually he who objectifies himself, mask for mask. He begins to exert upon himself a powerful allure of self-seduction, as if he wanted to persuade himself to finally declare himself found. After all, what ultimately looked back at him from the mirror was no longer a short-winded philologist, or an intellectually dependent devotee of Schopenhauer and Wagner, but the image of a man who believed that he had reason to look upon himself as a genius and a philosophizing destiny. The author of The Gay Science, the poet of Zarathustra, the first psychologist of his time, the reassessor of all values. What Nietzsche had before him as his objectified self was in reality nothing parenthetical. Yet, what is it that seduces him into plunging into his own image, like Narcissus, in order to drown in himself? There can be no doubt that the daring presenter of himself also had a chance. even at the dangerous heights at which his performance of self was enacted, to withdraw from the masks and let them remain as ephemeral countenances, that is, as transitory incarnations of a potential. No search is programmed a priori as a flight from pain into madness, provided the thinking actor understands his own play as a play and sufficiently draws on the commitment to life to what can be endured. In this way he could carry his quote-unquote psychonautical circle to its conclusion and burn the last deadly phantoms of the divine incarnation behind him. Actually, in his post-Zarathustrian period, whenever his compulsion to suffer gave way, Nietzsche sometimes comes very close to an amorphous tranquility, at least until the images finally deluge and devastate him. With this, our dramaturgical meditation on Nietzsche's metamorphoses comes to a critical point. Which mask would be left for the thinker on the stage after he played himself out to the very limit of what could be incarnated in the tortuously sublime figure of Zarathustra? Where would he find the gestures of a post-Zarathustrian playfulness? How would he elevate his impossible prophetic exhibition through a fifth masking, and make the attempt to incarnate immoralistically in Dionysus something he could survive? Is not a denial the only thing that remains after a theatrical explosion of this kind, whether it be in the form of a retreat into madness, a resignation into silence, or a metamorphosis into the wise fool? Nietzsche captured with his characteristic precision his experience of the self and the difficult position of a Zarathustra who has left the stage without having a new role. Quoting here from pages 342 and 43. Except for these 10 days of work, author's note of reference to the enthusiastic days spent in writing Zarathustra, the years during and above all after Zarathustra were a disaster without equal. One pays dearly for the privilege of being immortal. One dies many times during one's own lifetime to make up for it. There is something I call the rancour of greatness. Everything great, whether a work or a deed, turns, once it has been accomplished, against him who has accomplished it. Precisely because of the fact that he has accomplished it, he is now weak. He can no longer endure his own accomplishment. He can no longer look it in the face. To have something behind one that one never could have wanted, something that will be bound up in the fate of humanity, to now have it upon oneself, it almost crushes one to death, the rancour of greatness. Is not the plot of the drama also laid open here? This unhappy compulsion to see behind what he himself is doing, this incessant doubling of the self into what is spontaneous and what is remembered, this despairing undertaking, the attempt to take possession of himself as the incarnation of the most grandiose of self-representations. This is indeed the rancour of greatness, that it is compelled through its greatness to suffocate that which wants to reunite it with its ego. What cannot be questioned is that Nietzsche experienced himself often enough in authentic medial terms. He knew the resignation of doubt and an almost somnambulistic constancy in the articulation of his powers. But his inherent make-up undid the liberating effect of such experiences time and time again. What repeatedly prevailed was the subsequent ego-centered, ich-haft, self-assessment of non-egotistical creative processes. Thus Nietzsche constantly doubled himself into the praise-giver and the recipient of that praise. In spite of all his psychological wisdom, he consistently fell back into the posture of one who felt it necessary either to be praised or valued by others, or, for lack of recognition, to sing his own praises. Because of this, he remained condemned to exploit himself permanently, and to capitalize eternally on his own vitality and intellectual power. His new ideas were consistently devoured by the oldest structure of values, and the dead ego's compulsion towards self-assessment always prevailed at the expense of any vital efforts. As long as he remained trapped within the structure of self-assessment, he was far from freeing himself from the terror of values. Under these circumstances, even a quote-unquote reassessment of all values provided no release. The point of crisis occurs when it becomes apparent that an incarnation of the gods is more likely than a quote-unquote twilight of the idols. It is more likely that the subject will flay itself to death as the raw material for a revaluation of self, than that its value system will release it. Nietzsche's structure is predetermined in favour of a suffering grandiosity that creates value. In having to decide between existential happiness and value-creating greatness, this structure as it exists within him always chooses that which, at the cost of a terrible self-sacrifice, serves the process of the creation of values. I believe the complex of ideas that was involved in developing Nietzsche's theorem of the will to power can best be understood by bearing the foregoing in mind. Perhaps it is a bad habit within the field of Nietzsche research, and an example of the most dangerous type of carelessness that its scholars specialize in either the earlier or the later Nietzsche, and interpret the aphorisms on the will to power as representing his fundamental philosophical teaching. Especially since we now know that this quote-unquote major work is counterfeit, having been compiled by Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth. In contrast to this, we must insist that the early Nietzsche was correct in his assessment of the most important matters in a way that the later Nietzsche was not. And, as often as it has always been noted that the Nietzsche of Zarathustra and the will to power is much closer to the Nietzsche of the birth of tragedy than the Nietzsche of the middle period, who presented himself as a play actor of positivism, this proximity has, for the most part, never been properly related back to Nietzsche's prototypes of truth, Wahrheitsmodelle, at the beginning and end of his philosophical career. A joining of this beginning and end reveals that the tenets of the will to power represent positive versions, Positivierungen, as dubious as they are desperate, of the negative model we have read in The Birth of Tragedy. The earlier prototype of truth, quote, "the unbearable inflicts upon us the compulsion toward art," end quote, was on its path towards a suspect metaphysics of energetic egotism, transformed into an affirmative one, divested of its memory of the dialectics of the unbearable, and paraphrased into the later prototype of truth, quote, "the will to power establishes a life-enhancing illusion," end quote. Even for the early Nietzsche, life viewed subspecie artis is essentially a composing, dichtend, self-representation whose movement struggles away from the unendurable towards what can be endured, and suggests both a volition and a compulsion toward art. Hence the will to art appears, thanks to a constitutive mystification, in its own interests, for sich selbst, as the primary element. For purposes of critical reflection, however, it is recognizable as the secondary, subsequent element precisely because it is grounded in the self-veiling of the unendurable. We are only indirectly aware of what we are unable to endure as such in the forms of traces of memory that catastrophe of individuation has left behind within us, or in the shuddering contemplation of the convulsions of those who take the secret of their immediate encounter with the unendurable with them when they perish. For this reason, the will to illusion no way originates in and of itself, but is grounded in a compulsion toward illusion. But when we hear the theorem of the will to power, our recollection of this more complex structure seems to have been obliterated in an almost ingenious way. Nietzsche's later thoughts allows the will to power to ascend to the highest rank, and any previous urgency to disappear in the fact of will. In this, Nietzsche's basic aesthetic ontological hypotheses are initially plausible. If individuated life is essentially a composing of self-representation above a foundation of painful pleasure, Schmerzlust, and impulsiveness, then one can certainly be of the opinion that the universal concert to a great extent is composed of the noise of these compositions of self, which resound against each other and are dependent on each other. Since life is already compelled to art because it has been afflicted with individuation, it must discover within itself the yearning that the philosopher identifies as a will to power, and that more than anything signifies the will to implement one's own true lie of life and art at the expense of others. Even if this process were to function in this way, the will to power would still have been pre-established in a compulsion toward the will to power. Certainly no vital composition of self can exist without a will towards its own realization. Still, the active composition of self as such is based on a compulsion towards composition, dichten müssen, and the faculty for composition, dichten können, that precedes all volition. We can now see how Nietzsche deviates from his earlier insight vis-à-vis subjectivity and the metaphysics of volition. If life is self-composition, then the will to power is only one of its possible exegeses, and probably not the fundamental one. For a faculty, können, must precede any volition. Thus the axiom of the will to power seems plausible only to those who have in mind a sort of social Darwinism with Hobbesian undertones that has been transposed into the realm of aesthetics, as it were in the form of an artistic struggle of all against all with the final survival of the fittest. That Nietzsche himself operated with such hallucinations of an absolute polemics, having been influenced by not least of all Darwin, who was his contemporary, need not be demonstrated. In truth, however, the self-composing structure of life can develop optimally only once it has taken possession of a faculty. By this I mean that the will to power is a perversion of the right to strength. Wherever a will to power is proposed as the ultimate wisdom, the subject already mistrusts his own power to compose himself, and attempts to think himself into safety by means of the application of will. A will to power need not be presupposed as long as the right to strength is confident in itself. We have already indicated the extent to which an inability to believe in his own self-actuated Nietzsche's logical mechanism. I'll leave the interpretation of that sentence to the listener. Whenever strength feels its release obstructed by a surplus of restrictive counterforce, it must want to maintain itself all that much more in its remaining expression. Its intention to be itself has at its base not the structure of a will to power, but that of a will toward being able to want, which suggests nothing other than the phantasm of the restoration of naive, uninterrupted, unfettered strength, which can, to the same extent that it may and occasionally wants. Probably Nietzsche's most serious psychological and philosophical error was displacing will from the status of the occasional to that of the fundamental. Accordingly, the construction of the will to power betrayed itself as a symptom of excessively restricted strength. A situation that is by no means equivalent to weakness, but quite the contrary suggests strength with a bad conscience. It is an energy that has not grown into its condition of restraint. For this reason it wants, hungry for a release from restraint, to speak freely of itself through an immoralistic act of unleashing. Certainly not in order to leave the door open to malice as such, but so as to be able to applaud an absolute expression of strength. It is hardly necessary to state that this applause has been inspired by a utopia of the innocence of the body, a utopia in which the traumas, traumata, of the civilizing process register their protest. It is impossible not to overhear in this the voice of a wounded life, and in this it is dialectically interconnected, as revolt, with a destiny of oppression. It is, like every kinnish act, a contribution on the part of immoralism to the success of life, which must release from the soul a whole world of moral restraints and wrongs, and to this end also engages in volition and provocations. I would suggest that Nietzsche's tenets that pertain to the will to power be understood primarily as a subjective reclaiming of older quasi-fundamental ontological insights, and second, that this reclaiming to be integrated into the psychodrama of the thinker as an act of Dionysian kynicism, kynismus. The will to power is, in my view, not a quote-unquote metaphysical thesis that should be read in the indicative, but a hypothetical dramaturgical pose. Its truth value cannot be discussed in terms of a final statement, but only as that of an intellectual dose to be administered in the midst of a crisis of strength. Contrary to Heidegger, I would not read Nietzsche's corresponding statements on the subject as representing, without exception, the termination of European metaphysics in an act of nihilism, however seductive this master interpretation may be. It is suggestive as an interpretation of individual lines of thought in Nietzsche's work, but its plausibility collapses as we look more closely to the dramatic tangle of Nietzsche's games of reflection. The will to power. I read it as a self-therapeutic, and if you will, allopathic prescription, which pursues the fundamental ontological motif of tranquility by means of a radically subjective jargon. For the essence of the volition of the will to power indicates something that would lead away from the will. It quote-unquote wills tranquility in the sense of an ability to entrust oneself to the limitations of one's life, and the sense of permitting oneself to let go, which in turn leads to the pure intelligent ability to be. But in order to permit what he wants, he needs, having become malevolent through experience, the protective armament of a sovereignty that would no longer feel compelled to defer to judgments and restraints. Only because of this, Zarathustra must proclaim the ethos of liberation from all the old authorities and the intonation of a neo-authoritarian. Because Nietzsche cannot trust his own ability to compose himself, he must appear as the legislator of freedom from the law. His energy is expended almost entirely in declaring its unrestrained permission to expend itself. One can sum up the dramatic mechanism behind Nietzsche's appearance in the mask of the Antichrist in this single statement: I want to be permitted. And this desire for permission, however, is only the parody of an ability that must already be present for a long time before a volition can be activated. Because the condition of having to want is behind this volition. Volition and compulsion belong within the same sphere of non-freedom. Perhaps Nietzsche, because of his tenacious insistence on the will, is unable to experience how a liberating "you are able to" would anticipate his "I want to." Like most of the moralists of the modern era, he has failed to appreciate that the origins of justice lie in permission, that is, the acceptance of a great abundance, and not in prohibition, as a narrow-minded dialectics would have it, and also not in the proprietary appropriateness of a decisive establishment of values. That will be the determining factor in Nietzsche's immoralistic concept of justice. I'll return to this theme in Chapter 5. Any attitude that maintains an attitude of "I want to be permitted" inevitably remains the inversion of "you may not." The rebellious will neglects experience in order to relinquish itself to a struggle-free ability to exist beyond subjugation and revolt. The experience of being upheld by a legitimate authority suggests nothing else. At the same time, this would be the experience of a self-love that is neither aggressive nor meek, and which admits that a love has accommodated it. These experiences have only one thing in common. They do not allow themselves to be induced by volition. For Nietzsche, however, all that remained in this sphere was the attitude of standing firm in the face of an almost fatal state of deprivation. Of course, tranquility is never achieved through a will to tranquility. If the composition of self-prefer is to take place behind the protective shield of a self-betraying will to power, then the self-expression of he who is composing himself is not released, but rather ensnared in the paroxysms of a forced spontaneity. If impudence elevates itself to the level of a principle, thus falsely platonizing itself, then opinions will burst forth that are merely allegories of impertinence, and that signify anything but this self, in the positive sense of the word. Nietzsche knew this as well. Quote, "We always find ourselves in the initial stages of all vices, so very near to virtue." End quote. No one understood better than this, the gentlest of all immoralists, that virtue is at the root of every vice. In him, his quote-unquote super-refinement, to use Lou Andreas Salome's expression, was at the root of an allegorical brutality. As the will to malice, impudence must become the parody of a divinely naive unaffectedness that flutters before all efforts to achieve effortlessness. Nietzsche's audience will view his final performance with great anxiety. They observe a man who will have to entrust his last insights to his failure. From now on, observing him will be painful. Anyone who, like this author, is compelled on principle to want a fundamental ruthlessness merely to expose the space in which he could become to himself, appears as someone who is about to fall apart. An active nihilism offers only a terrible substitute for a man's ability to remain on friendly terms with himself. The revolt may not, in any case, be substantiated. Through his frantic proclamation of egotism as the reversal of the centuries-old lies of altruism, the thinker risked himself, becoming the battleground for a ruthless battle of principles in which his own well-being could play only a minor role, as he had been true in the oldest altruistic violations. In that Nietzsche produced allegories of egotism from himself, aus sich, with increasing vehemence, he forgot the minimum of legitimate egotism that would have been necessary to render his terrible astuteness endurable for the poor animal behind the masks. Through the efforts of his will towards egotism, Nietzsche neglected to accept himself as a being who, without the support of a principle, and on the basis of his own pre-existing nature, had already always had permission to be egotistical. He wanted to transfer what had been conceded and allowed all along into something self-willed, perhaps so as to no longer rely on anything except the isolation of all good spirits. Did he not in this way venture too near to the terrible truth? In his finale, Nietzsche proclaimed the unprecedented freedoms, the most extreme releases from restraint, the ultimate intensifications. And yet no one responded to him. The thinker remained alone with his paradox, and his freedom was tantamount to a metaphysical punishment. Like a Baiazzo of egotism, he ascended from his isolation in order to take the stage, and presented to his audience the gift of freedom, which he himself had taken but never actually received. Perhaps his greatness lay in the fact that he gave what he himself lacked, and his undoing in the fact that he never received as a gift what he wanted to pass on to others. Against his will, he was the last altruist,